For nearly 80 years, millions of Africans have used a currency that critics argue has remained closely tied to decisions made outside the continent. What if one financial system could shape the destiny of entire nations, determining who grows wealthy or who remains dependent? Now, three West African countries are attempting something many once believed impossible. After cutting military and political ties with France, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have launched a new regional investment bank with ambitions to finance their own development and reduce reliance on long-standing financial structures. Their broader vision even includes the possibility of creating a new monetary system backed by Africans' owned resources. If successful, supporters believe it could transform the economic future of the Sahel. Critics warned it could trigger major geopolitical and financial consequences. This isn't just a story about bank or currencies. It is a story about sovereignty, influence, and the struggle over who controls Africa's economy future. To understand why this moment has attracted so much attention, we must first revisit a system whose roots stretch back to the end of the Second World War, a system often referred to as Françafrique. For decades, Françafrique has been used to describe the close political, economic, and financial relationship between France and many of its former African colonies. Supporters have viewed it as a framework, while critics argued it allows France to retain significant influence long after former colonial rule ended. Former French President François Mitterrand once remarked that without Africa, France's place in the 21st century would be profoundly diminished. Whether interpreted literally or symbolically, the statement has often been cited in discussions about the importance of Africa to France's global influence. Today, many observers believe that relationship is entering a new phase. The government of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger has severed key politics and military ties with France and are now pursuing a different economic path. One of their most ambitious projects is the creation of the Regional Investment Bank, designed to finance development on their own terms while reducing dependence on existing financial institutions. Beyond that, decisions have emerged about the possibility of eventually introducing a new regional currency supported by tangible assets such as gold and other natural resources. These developments are unfolding at a time when debate over the future of the US dollar and the international trade have become increasingly visible. US President Donald Trump has publicly warned countries considering alternatives to the dollar that abandoning it could carry significant economic consequences.
We're going to keep it that way, okay? And if we lost the world standard dollar, that would be like losing a war, a major world war. I'm just saying, if people want to challenge it, they can, but they're going to have to pay a big price. And I don't think any of them are willing to pay that price.
Despite those warnings, conversations about conducting trade in local currencies continues to grow across Africa. During a regional summit, Kenyan President William Ruto questioned why neighboring African countries should rely on the US dollar when trading with one another.
Traders from Kenya selling to Djibouti have to look for US dollars. How is US dollars part of the trade between Djibouti and Kenya? Why?
Those questions reflect a much larger debate taking place across the continent. For many African policymakers, the issue is no longer just political independence, it is economic independence. Imagine earning money in your own country, paying taxes in your own country, and doing businesses inside your own borders. Yet, key decisions affecting your financial systems are influenced from outside the continent. For critics of the CFA franc system, this has long represented one of the Africans' biggest economic challenge. For more than 8 decades, 14 African countries have shared a monetary arrangement linked to francs. Supporters argue the system provides currency stability, while critics contend it has limited monetary sovereignty and constrained independent economic policymaking. If the Alliance of Sahel States succeed in building an alternative financial architecture, supporters believe it could fundamentally reshape economic relations between Africa and Europe. Some commenters have even argued that France's global economic influence has historically benefited from its close financial ties with Africa. Whether those predictions ultimately prove accurate remains uncertain. What is certain is that the political landscape is changing rapidly. Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger have taken one of their boldest steps yet, but establishing a sovereign development bank with an initial capitalization approaching $1 billion. For the leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, these institutions represent more than a financial project. It symbolizes an attempt to regain a greater control over their own development. When Burkina Faso's transitional leader, Captain Ibrahim Traore, was asked whether these reforms would eventually change the CFA franc, his response drew widespread attention. Perhaps, he replied. Everything that keeps us dependent, we intend to break those chains. That message has become central to the AES vision. At the office launch ceremony, Financial Minister described the new institution as an important step towards financing infrastructure, agriculture, energy, industry, and technological innovation using resources generated within the region itself. Their objective is straightforward: strengthen domestic investment capacities while reducing dependence on external financing. For Traore and many supporters of the project, genuine sovereignty couldn't exist without economic sovereignty. He has repeatedly argued that African nations must first rely on their own resources before expecting solutions from elsewhere. But before celebrating this vision, history offers an important warning. This is not the first time an African leader has attempted to establish monetary independence. In 1963, Togo's first president, Sylvanus Olympus, planned to introduce a national currency and reduce his country's dependency on the CFA system. Just days before the official launch, Olympus was assassinated. His death has remained one of the continent's most discussed political tragedy and continues to feature prominently in debates about monetary sovereignty in Africa. That history raises difficult questions today. Could the Alliance of Sahel States succeed where early efforts struggled? Can African nations establish financial institutions capable of supporting development while maintaining independence from traditional Western financial structures? Or will they encounter many of the same obstacles that confronted previous generations? To answer those questions, we first have to understand how the system known as Françafrique emerged after the Second World War, and why it continues to shape conversations about African economic future. Because this story does not begin in the 21st century, it begins in 1945 as Europe emerged devastated from World War II and France faced the enormous challenge of rebuilding its economy and restoring its international influence. By the end of the Second World War, France faced an enormous challenge. Much of its industrial capacity had been devastated. Its economy was struggling to recover, and its influence on the world stage had been severely weakened. Many historians argued that France's policymakers believed rebuilding the nation would require maintaining close economic ties with their African territories, even as the area of former colonialism began to fade. Political independence, they believe, might eventually become unavoidable. Economic independence, however, was another matter. According to critics of France's post-colonial policy, the objective became preserving influence through financial institutions rather than direct colonial administration. Instead of governing African territories outright, they argued France established mechanisms that allow it to remain deeply involved in the economic affairs of several newly independent states. One of the most significant of those mechanisms was the CFA franc. Originally created during the colonial era, the currency continued after independence and today remains in use across 14 African nations, dividing into two monetary unions. In West Africa, those countries include Benin, Burkina Faso, Côte d'Ivoire, Guinea-Bissau, Mali, Niger, Senegal, and Togo. In Central Africa, the currency is used in Cameroon, the Central African Republic, Chad, the Republic of Congo, Equatorial Guinea, and Gabon. Supporters of the CFA system argue that it provides monetary stability. Critics, however, contend that the arrangement has become at the expense of monetary sovereignty. One of the most debated features of the system involved the management of foreign exchange reserves. For decades, member states were required to deposit a substantial portion of their foreign reserves into special accounts linked to the franc's treasury. Under previous arrangements, these reached 50%, while additional reserves requirements also applied under the system. To understand why this became controversial, imagine a country exporting valuable natural resources, whether it was gold from Mali, cocoa from Cote d'Ivoire, or oil from Central Africa, critics argued that a significant share of the financial reserve generated by those exports ultimately remained outside the direct control of the producing nation. The exchange rate itself also became a source of debate. Before 1994, the CFA franc was fixed at 50 francs CFA to 1 French franc. Then comes one of the most controversial decisions in the currency's history. In January 1994, the CFA franc was officially devalued by 50%, changing the exchange rate to 100 CFA franc for 1 French franc. For ordinary citizens, the effects were immediate. Imported goods became far more expensive. Household purchasing power declined. Governments suddenly faced rising costs on essential import. Many Africans still remember that period as one of the most painful economic adjustments in the region's modern history. Later, when France adopted the euro, the CFA franc became pegged to Europe's common currency at a fixed exchange rate. Supporters argued this maintained financial stability. Opponents countered that trying African economies to a much stronger Europe currency reduced competitiveness. Imports became relatively affordable, making European products attractive in local markets. At the same time, African-made goods often struggled to compete internationally because of the exchange rate dynamics. Many economists have debated the long-term impact of these arguments, but critics argue it discourages industrialization by making local manufactured products less competitive than imports. The controversy surrounding the CFA system extends beyond economic. It is also rooted in history. One of the easiest and the most frequently cited examples is Guinea. When Guinea gained independence in 1958, President Ahmed Sékou Touré rejected continued French control and declared that his country preferred freedom, even if it meant economic hardship. His famous words became symbolic across Africa. "We prefer freedom in poverty to wealth in slavery." Relationships between Paris and Conakry deteriorated rapidly. Historical accounts describe France withdrawing personnel, equipment, and administrative support almost immediately after independence. Some researchers and former officials have also alleged that covert operations sought to undermine Guinea's new monetary system, including claims that the counterfeit Guinea currency was circulated to destabilize the economy. These allegations remain part of the ongoing history debate, but they have played an important role in shaping perceptions of France's relationship with its former colonies. Whether every allegation can be fully verified or not, the political message received by many African leaders was unmistakable. Breaking away from existing financial structure appear to carry enormous financial risk. That historical backdrop explains why today's reforms proposed by the Alliance of Sahel States attract so much attention. For supporters, this is not simply another economic policy. It represents an attempt to complete a process of sovereignty that political independence alone never fully achieved. Critics of the old system also point to decades of capital flight across several African countries. Various studies have estimated that billions of dollars left the continent over many years through illicit financial flow, profit repatriations, and offshore transfers. Countries rich in oil, uranium, timber, and other strategic resources often generated enormous wealth on paper, while many citizens continue facing poverty, unemployment, and limited public service. The contrasts become increasingly difficult to ignore. Natural resources flow outward, yet roads, hospitals, electricity, network, and industrial projects frequently lagged behind. Development assistance also became part of the debate. Although France has provided significant aid and investment across Africa, critics argue that many contracts ultimately benefited French companies supplying equipment, technical service, and infrastructure. In their view, much of the financial value circulated back to the same businesses that had originally received the contract. One example frequently cited involves Orano, formerly known as Areva, the French nuclear company that operates uranium mine in Niger for decades. Supporters of the company argue those operations generated employment, investment, and export revenue. Critics respond that despite supplying uranium that contributed to France's energy sector, Niger itself remained amongst the countries with the world's lowest level of electricity access. For many observers, this became a powerful symbol of Africa's resource paradox. A country rich in strategic mineral continues struggling to provide reliable electricity for its own citizens. That wider debate resurfaced dramatically in 2017 during President Emmanuel Macron's visit to Burkina Faso. During a question and answer session with university students, one student asked why educational institutions continued experiencing serious electricity shortage. Macron replied that solving Burkina Faso's electricity challenges was ultimately the responsibility of the country's own government rather than France. His response quickly became one of the most discussed moments of the visit. The situation attracted even more attention when Burkina Faso's then president, Roch-Marc Christian Kabore, briefly left the room, prompting Macron to joke that he had gone to repair the air condition. The remark spread rapidly across social media and was interpreted in very different ways across Africa. For some, it was harmless humor. For others, it symbolized the imbalance that had long criticized relationship between France and many of its former colonies. The exchange between President Emmanuel Macron and the students in Burkina Faso did more than dominate headlines. It reignited an old debate that had echoed across Africa for decades. How much influence should France still have in the affairs of its former colonies? That decision became even more intense because of the remarks often attributed to former President Jacques Chirac, who acknowledged that France had benefited enormously from its historical relationship with Africa. He famously stated that a significant share of France's prosperity had been built through centuries of exploiting African resources. Whether reviewed as an administration or reflection on history, those comments continue to fuel conversations about the lasting economic relationship between France and Africa. For many critics, the issue isn't simply about history. It is about whether the current economic relationship still delivers meaningful benefits to ordinary Africans. Take Burkina Faso, for example. Despite decades of cooperations with French institutions and companies, reliable electricity has remained a challenge in many parts of the country. To critics, this raises an uncomfortable question. If Africa possesses abundant natural resources, why do so many resource-rich nations still struggle to provide basic services for their own population? The debate has not been limited to African leaders. In 2019, Italian's Deputy Prime Minister Luigi De Moore ignited a diplomatic storm, often publicly accusing France of continuing to exploit African while contributing to the migration pressure affecting Europe. He argued that discussions about migration should also address what he described as the underlying economic causes. According to Di Maio, some European power, particularly France, had yet to fully abandon practices rooted in the colonial era. His comment triggered an immediate diplomatic response. France summoned the Italian ambassador to explain the remark, highlighting just how politically sensitive the issue had become. For many observers, that strong reaction demonstrated the importance France attaches to its relationship with Africa. For critics of the CFA franc system, however, the controversy goes so much deeper than diplomatic disagreement. They argue that monetary control has always been one of the most powerful tools of political influence. That brief is reinforced by several historical episodes frequently cited across the continent. One of the most prominent examples is Sylvanus Olympio's, the first president of independent Togo. In 1963, Olympio sought to introduce a national currency and reduce his country's dependency on franc's CFA. Supporters viewed the plan as a decisive step towards economic sovereignty, but before the project could be implemented, Olympus was assassinated during a military coup. His death remained one of Africa's most debated political events. Some historians have noted that the soldier who killed Olympio, Nasimpe Ayadema, had previously served in the French Foreign Legion before later becoming president of Togo himself. The circumstances surrounding those events continue to generate historical debate, but for many Africans, Olympio's assassination became a powerful warning about the risk associated with challenging established financial systems. His story is often mentioned alongside those of other African leaders who attempted major political or economic reforms. What is undeniable, however, is that France has conducted numerous military operations across Africa since 1960s. French government have generally described these missions as security operations requested by partners governments to combat instability or terrorism. Critics, on the other hand, have argued that some interventions also served to preserve France's strategy influence within the region. Regardless of which interpretation one accepts, the result has been decades of debate over sovereignty, security, and economic independence. For many supporters of today's reforms, political independence was only the first chapter. For many supporters of today's reforms, political independence was only the first chapter. True independence, they argue, requires control over finance, investments, and monetary policies. That is why 2025 marks such an important turning point. In December of that year, the Alliance of Sahel States, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger officially launched the AES Investment Bank, known as the BCID-AES. Rather than relying primarily on traditional international lenders, the three governments announced plans to finance regional development through an institution owned by the alliance itself. With an initial capitalization approaching $900 million, the bank is intended to support infrastructure, industrialization, agriculture, energy, and other strategic sectors across the region. For AES leaders, these institutions represent more than another financial organization. They describe it as the foundation of a new model of development built on regional ownership and greater economic autonomy. Regular reviews of these channels have already seen several of the ambitious projects currently planned across the Sahel, from proposed energy investments and airport developments to new highways and regional railway network designed to improve trade and connectivity. Projects of this scale often required enormous financing. Traditionally, government has turned to institutions such as the IMF or the World Bank, where loans frequently come with policies conditions attached. The AES leadership argues that a regional investment bank could provide greater flexibility by allowing members states to prioritize projects based on their own development strategies. Perhaps the most striking feature of the initiative is how the bank itself is being financed. Rather than depending entirely on foreign borrowing, each member country has committed 5% of its tax revenue to help capitalize the institution. Supporters describe this as a deliberate effort to reduce dependency on external lenders and demonstrate confidence in the region's own economic potentials. At the same time, the alliance continues expanding partnership beyond its traditional Western allies. Countries associated with BRICS, along with China and several African financing institutions, have increasingly appeared in discussions about future investment cooperations. The objectives, according to AES officials, is diversification rather than dependence on any single external partner. In their view, development priorities should be determined inside Africa, not by institutions located thousands of kilometers away. For the first time in decades, supporters argue regional governments are attempting to pool their financial resources primarily to fund their own infrastructure instead of directing large portions of capital into external financial systems. According to the statement from AES officials, the broader vision rests on three major pillars. The first is exploring financial instruments backed by tangible assets such as gold and other natural resources. The second is increasing regional control over investment decisions so that major infrastructure projects can be approved locally rather than relying heavily on outside financing. The third is expanding trade conducted in African currency, reducing transaction costs associated with converting through foreign reserve currencies. The concept itself is not entirely new. Across Africa, similar initiatives have already begun taking shape. The African Continent Free Trade Area, launched in 2019, seeks to strengthen trade between African economies by reducing barriers across the continent. For many observers, the AES initiative represents another step in that broader movement, this time extending integration beyond trade into finance, investment, and monetary cooperations. The movement towards greater finance independence is not limited to the Alliance of Sahel States. Across the continent, African governments are beginning to build payment systems designed to make it easy for Africans to trade with one another without relying on foreign currency. One major milestone came in 2022. When African financial institutions expanded the Pan-African payment and settlement system. The initiative is designed to allow businesses in different African countries to settle cross-border transactions directly in their local currency instead of first converting it to US dollars or euro. Supporters estimate that such system could save African economy billions of dollars every year in transaction cost. Similar efforts are emerging elsewhere. Countries with the East African communities have been expanding digital payment platforms that facilitate cross-border trade using regional currencies, making commercial faster and reduce dependence on external financial system. The underlying argument is straightforward. If two African countries are trading with each other, why should every transaction require a third country's currency? The exact question was raised by Kenyan President William Ruto during a regional summit.
Let me give you an example. Traders from Djibouti selling to Kenya, or traders from Kenya selling to Djibouti, have to look for US dollars. How is US dollars part of the trade between Djibouti and Kenya? Why?
His point was not an attack on the dollar itself. Rather, he argued that African countries should naturally conduct trade amongst themselves using African currency whenever possible, while receiving foreign currencies for trade with countries outside the continent. That idea is gaining traction well beyond Africa. The BRIC bloc has also explored expanded trade using members' national currency rather than relying exclusively on the US dollars. Although each initiative follows its own path, they all reflect a broader global decisions about diversifying international payment systems. For leaders of the Alliance of Sahel States, this development reinforces the belief that Africans should not remain on the sidelines of these transformations. Captain Ibrahim Traore has constantly represented economic sovereignty as inseparable from political sovereignty. Supporters often point to his leadership style as part of this message. Unlike many head of state known for lavish lifestyle, Traore has cultivated an image of simplicity, appearing in military uniform and emphasizing service over ceremony. Whether symbolic or practical, that image has resonated with many supporters across Africa. His central argument is equally straightforward: removing foreign military forces. He suggests it's only part of the struggle. If key financial decisions remain dependent on external institutions, genuine independence remains incomplete. It is a strategy filled with enormous risk. Traore has often referred African leaders such as Thomas Sankara and Sylvanus Olympius, whose attempt to reshape their countries featured ended under tragedy circumstances. For him, however, continuing under the system that he believed perpetuates dependence carries its own long-term cost. He has repeatedly told Burkinabe citizens that genuine freedom demands sacrifice, resilience, and confidence in their own abilities rather than permanent reliance on outside financial support. Not everyone is convinced. Some economists and political analysts describe the AES project as an ambitious experiment whose long-term success remains uncertain. They argue that creating strong financial institutions require not only political determinations but also sustained investment, investors, confidence, sound governance, and microeconomic stability. Other points to reform introduced within the CFA system in recent years, including proposals surrounding the eco-currency as evidence that the existing monetary framework has already begun evolving. Supporters of the AES, however, argue that those reforms do not fundamentally alter the undying structure of the external monetary influence. Regardless of where one stands in this debate, one fact stands undeniably. The AES Investment Bank now exists. For the first time in decades, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger possess a regional financial institution specifically created to finance development projects under their own collective leadership. Whether it ultimately becomes a foundation of a new African financial architecture, a struggle against economic and geopolitical pressure, will depend on the decisions made in the years ahead. The larger question is no longer whether African nations desire greater economic sovereignty. That conversation is already taking place across the continent. The real question is whether these new institutions can deliver sustainable growth, attract investment, maintain financial stability, and withstand the immense political and economic pressure that often accompany major structural change. History has shown that transforming financial system is never easy. The Alliance of Sahel States is now attempting exactly that. If successful, this initiative could influence how African countries finance development for decades to come. If it fails, it may become another chapter in the continent's long history of unfinished economic reforms. Either ways, the outcome will reach far beyond the borders of Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger. It could shape the future of Africa's economic integration itself. What do you think? Could the Alliance of Sahel States become the foundation of a new era of African finance independence, or will history repeat itself once again? Share your thoughts in the comment section below. If you enjoyed this documentary, don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss our next deep dive into the stories shaping Africa and the world.